Ancient Teutonic Priesthood by H. Munro Chadwick. Read at meeting of May 16, 1900. 1. The Priesthood of the Ancient Germans. Caesar, in his account of the Germans, makes the statement that they had no Druids. This statement has given rise to much controversy, for it is not clear whether he meant to say that the Germans had no priests at all, or merely that they had no priesthood similar to that of the Gauls. In Tacitus's account of the Germans, 150 years later, the priesthood constitutes an important element in their society, and is characterized by features which it is difficult to reconcile with the supposition that it was then a new institution. As a matter of fact, a German priest is said to have been present at the triumph of Germanicus, AD 14. In order to comprehend Caesar's meaning, it is necessary first to examine briefly his account of the Druids. According to his account, the Druids had the entire control of religion and the direction of both public and private sacrifices. This organization extended over the whole of Gaul, and they were presided over by an archdruid, who was elected for life. They met annually in a consecrated place within the territories of the Carnutes, a district which was regarded as the center of Gaul. All suits of whatever character, whether private or public, were here brought before them, and the decision was left entirely in their hands. They could enforce their sentences, whether against individuals or states, under penalty of excommunication, which was equivalent to outlawry. The Druids were, moreover, instructors of the young. They were excused from all tribute and military service, and devoted themselves to the study and exposition of natural and moral philosophy. They appear not to have been a distinct caste, since it is stated that many were induced to embrace the profession by the desire to escape national obligations. They were sometimes, whether usually or not is uncertain, drawn from the ranks of the nobility. Thus, Diucarchus the Aeduan was a Druid, while his brother Dumnorix held the chief magistracy of the Aedui. Some additional information is to be obtained from Strabo and Diodorus. According to Strabo, there are 3 classes of persons who are especially honored by the Gauls, namely bards, vates, and druids. The bards are minstrels and poets. The vates are sacrificers and interpreters of natural phenomena, while the druids practice both religion and moral philosophy. They are considered to be the most just, and for this reason they are entrusted with the decision of all cases, both private and public. Formerly, they were even settled wars, and parted those who were on the point of fighting. Above all, they were entrusted with the settlement of suits for manslaughter. Diodorus gives much the same accounts. He states that the Vates, whom he calls seers, foretell the future by augury and by divination at sacrifices, and have the whole people in subjection to them. He calls the Druids, fancy Greek word, and says that they also were present at all sacrifices, for they think that offerings can be made to the gods and favors asked from them only through the mediation of those who are acquainted with their nature and, as it were, understood their language. According to Diodorus, therefore, both the Druids and the Vates were present at sacrifices. Concerning the sanctuaries of the Druids, we have very little information. According to Lucan and Tacitus, they inhabited, or, at all events, practiced their rites in sacred groves. This agrees with the well-known fact that reverence for trees was a leading feature in their worship. From these notices it appears that the Vates and the Druids were distinct classes of persons, though it is not very easy to distinguish between them. Both seem to have taken part in sacrifices. Prophetic power also seems to have been claimed by the Druid as well as by the Vates. Thus, according to Cicero, Diacaicus is claimed to have the power of foretelling the future, partly by auguries and partly by conjecture. It is of course possible that the two classes are confused to some extent by our authorities through ignorance. It seems probable, however, that the administration of justice belonged exclusively to the Druids. The female Druids, mentioned in later works, seem to be simply women possessed of prophetic powers. For information regarding the priestly system of the ancient Germans, we are dependent almost entirely upon Tacitus. His account of their duties may briefly be summarized as follows. 1. They had to take omens on public occasions. This included the casting of lots and the observation of the sacred horses. In the latter duty, the priest was accompanied by the king or the princeps citutatis. They had duties in connection with the meeting of the tribal assembly, too. They had to open the meeting by proclaiming silence, and to them alone belonged the right of inflicting punishment, both at the assembly and when the host was called out for war. Seems likely also that the right of proclaiming excommunication against persons guilty of cowardice belonged to them. They had the guardianship of the sacred groves and of the symbols and other holy objects which were kept there. When the host assembled for war, the priests took the sacred symbols from their sanctuaries and carried them into battle. Lastly, there can be little doubt that they had duties in connection with public sacrifices, though this is not explicitly stated by Tacitus. The information to be derived from early authorities is slight, but does not conflict with Tacitus's account. Ammianus Marcellinus states that over the priests of the Burgundians there presided a chief priest, called Sinistus, who held office for life and was irremovable. Jourdain says that the priests of the Goths were drawn from the nobility. According to Bede, the priests of the ancient English were forbidden to carry arms or to ride, except on mares. Here also we find the priests of Deira, presided over by a high priest. It cannot be denied that there is a certain resemblance between the position of the German priests and that of the Druids. In both cases we find some kind of regular priestly organization under the presidency of a chief priest, though among the Germans the organization seems to be confined within the limits of the state or tribe. Among the Germans, as among the Gauls, the priests seem to have been exempt from the duty of fighting, though they were present on the field of battle. Like the Druids, the German priests inhabit, or at all events had charge over, sacred groves. Lastly, in addition to their distinctively religious functions, both the Druids and the German priests have duties in connection with the administration of justice. Tacitus' information is here corroborated by the evidence of language. In Old High German, the word Ivarto, which literally means guardian of the law, is used to denote a priest of the Jews. This usage can hardly be explained, except on the supposition that the word was formerly used to denote a native priest of the Germans. It is likely, therefore, that it was in their capacity of guardians of the law that the priest opened the assembly and had the right of inflicting punishment. There are, however, two important points of difference between the Druids and the priests of the Germans. One, in the ministration of justice, the latter have rather the semblance of power than the reality. While among the Gauls the whole administration of justice lay exclusively in the hands of the Druids. Among the Germans, on the other hand, this power belonged to the assembled host, the priests being apparently merely the officers of the latter. 2. The German priesthood seems to be exclusively concerned with public duties, and to be almost entirely bound up with the state or tribe. Priests appear not to have been required for private worship. Tacitus distinctly states that the casting of lots, which on public occasions devolved on the state priest, in the private household, was performed by the head of the house. It is probable that such was the case also with private sacrifices, though from Tacitus's silence on the subject and Caesar's statements, the Germans were not zealous in offering sacrifice. It is likely that such sacrifices were not of frequent occurrence. Again, the priestly organization of the Germans seems not to extend beyond the bounds of each individual state. We hear indeed of religious festivals held in common by confederations of tribes, which were supposed to be connected by blood relationship. But we have no evidence for believing in any priestly organization which embraced the whole German people. The priesthood indeed seems to be an essentially tribal institution. Its public duties are primarily connected with the meeting of the tribal assembly. The sacred groves over which the priests preside appear in all cases to be tribal sanctuaries. Indeed, judging from such passages, it seems exceedingly probable that it was in these sacred groves that the tribal meetings, whether ordinary or called on emergency, were held. With the Gaulish Vates, the priests of the ancient Germans seem to have had little or nothing in common. There is no evidence that they laid claim to any gift of inspiration or prophecy. In this respect, they seem to have differed even from the Druids, for the latter combined divine inspiration with official position. We may contrast Diodorus' statement that the presence of Druids was required at sacrifices owing to their acquaintance with the nature of the gods, and Tacitus' account of the observation of the sacred horses, where it is remarked that the priest and king regarded themselves as the servants of the gods, but the horses as their confidants. So far as I am aware, the only passage on the strength of which any supernatural knowledge could be claimed for the priests of the ancient Germans, where it is stated that the priest of Nerthus becomes aware that the goddess is in her temple. But even here the inference is not certain, and at most the inspiration claimed is but slight. Prophecy and divination were of course by no means unknown among the ancient Germans. Yet whenever we find reference to such matters in early authorities, it is always by women that we find them practiced. Tacitus makes mention of Veleda and other celebrated prophetesses, and states that the Germans believed their women generally to possess a certain inherent prophetic power. Caesar says that the matrons in Arioustus' host prophesied defeat to their own side if they fought before the new moon. Strabo says that in the camp of the Cimbri there were gray-haired prophetesses who sacrificed prisoners and practiced divination from the flowing of their blood and the contortions of their bodies. In the Langobardic saga Gambara, the mother of the chiefs Ibor and Io seems to have been regarded as a prophetess. It is noteworthy that in the North, also, in later times, it is usually women who are endowed with prophetic powers, though men also are occasionally mentioned. But the terms priest or priestess are never applied to such persons. There is no reason for supposing that among the ancient Germans also, the two classes were not kept distinct. They have no feature in common except the offering of sacrifice. This, however, could probably, in later times certainly, be performed by any person without reference to priestly office or prophetic powers. So far, therefore, as the records give us any guidance, it appears that the priest of the ancient Germans was a tribal official who had to perform public ceremonies and preserve the traditional tribal law. They do not give us any ground for supposing that the priests laid claim to secret knowledge through divine inspiration. It may, however, be urged that it is unsafe to form such a conclusion as this on what is mainly negative evidence. The apparent absence of prophetic claims on the part of the priest may be due to the poverty of our information. It must be seen, therefore, whether the view here put forward is in harmony with the evidence of latter times. Direct evidence on this point is only to be obtained in the North, for elsewhere the native literature does not begin till all reminiscence of heathen society have vanished. The northern evidence will be discussed in the next section. In the meantime, however, there is some indirect evidence which tends to confirm this view. In the subdivisions of the tribe, the temporal leader seems to have held a semi-priestly position. Among many tribes, especially the Franks, the chief subdivision was the 100. This body formed a unit for military purposes, and had, like the tribe itself, its own meetings for the administration of justice. Each 100 had a leader of its own, who in Frankish annals is called Centenarius or Tribunus, and in the native languages, Huno or Kotink. Now this last word, Kotink, also known as Goding, is a derivative of God, and can hardly have meant anything else than priest. How such a name could come into use may be seen from the history of the Icelandic Goti. The local leader must in heathen times have had priestly functions. Again, the princeps, in his judicial capacity, seems to bear a semi-priestly character. We have seen that the guardianship of the tribal law was one of the chief cares of the priests, but the exposition and interpretation of the law in district and village assemblies was the business of the princeps. This custom survives in the ancient laws of the English, where it is laid down that the exposition of the secular law in the shiremut is the duty of the alderman. It is for ignorance of law that the alderman was rebuked by Alfred. Again, it seems likely that in the village community the headman performed priestly functions. Such was certainly the case in the north, and there is evidence at all events that the villages of the continent had similar religious festivals. In none of these bodies do we ever hear of persons of exclusively priestly character. Priestly duties appear everywhere to have been discharged by the temporal chief. The former prevalence of the patriarchal system is shown further by the use of the Old English poetical word alder, chief, prince, which in the plural means forefathers. In the sense of princeps, it has died out in prose, being displaced by the extended form alderman. In official terminology, however, it remains in the forms hundreds elder, chief of 100, or burhelder, mayor. In the smaller organizations of society, then, priestly duties seem to have been performed by the temporal chief. It is only the great organization, the tribe or state, which possesses a class with exclusively priestly functions. This fact is rendered especially important by the loose character of the bonds by which the ancient German state was held together. Caesar says distinctly that in time of peace, the state had no common magistracy, and as so far as the non-monarchical tribes are concerned, his words are amply confirmed by the evidence of Tacitus. Each district seems to have been governed by its own chief. Traditionally, no doubt, the bond of union in the tribe was held to be community of blood, but the tangible evidences of unity seem to be only 4 in number, namely the law, the assembly, the sanctuary, and the priesthood, all of which are closely connected. The priests seem to be the only permanent central authority in the tribe. Section 2. The priesthood in the north. In the north, there is practically no evidence for the existence of a priestly class. The word goti, priest, occurs frequently, but it is always, or almost always, used to denote a person who combined priestly duties with temporal power. The very rare exceptions, real or apparent to this rule, will be discussed in the following pages. It will be convenient to treat the 4 countries, Iceland, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, separately, owing to a very different social and political conditions which they present. 1. For Iceland, our information is extensive and trustworthy. In the early days of the colony, the more important settlers built temples of their own, often from the material of the temples which they had had in Norway. They exercised a kind of patriarchal authority over their followers, but bore no title of authority other than that of goti, their office and sphere of jurisdiction being called gotord. The smaller settlers, who had no temples of their own, gradually joined themselves to them, in order to enjoy both the use of their temples and the benefit of their protection. The goti had to keep up the temple and provide the sacrifices, in return for which the members of the gotord paid a temple tax, hoftoller. In the neighborhood of each temple there was a consecrated place set apart for the thing, or assembly, of the members of the gotord. At first, each community was practically independent, but in the year 930, a constitution was assembled, which embraced the whole island, a general assembly, Alþingi, being held annually at Uppsala. About 965, further changes were introduced. The country was divided into 4 quarters, each quarter containing 3 thing, except the northern quarter, which contained 4. Each thing contained 3 gotord. The number of gotord was thus limited to 39, and no temples erected after this date conveyed any magisterial rights. Every freeman had to belong to some gotord, but the delimitation of the gotord was not strictly geographical, and persons were free to change from one to another. The Lurgreta, or Legislative Council, was composed of the 39 gotar, to whom 9 titular gotar, chosen from the east, south, and west quarters, were subsequently added, and 96 assessors, 2 of whom were nominated by each goti. The whole was presided over by the Lagsogumatar, Speaker of the Law, an elected official. The right of opening the assembly, however, belonged to the Goti, who possessed the temple of Kielarnes, within whose jurisdiction the meeting place of the Alþingi lay. He is consequently called Goti, literally priest of the whole host. This constitution lasted with unessential modifications down to the end of the Commonwealth. It is to be observed that the Gotorth was inherited like any other piece of property, and could even be sold. On the introduction of Christianity, the priestly functions of the Gothi, of course, disappeared, but their political powers, and curiously, even the name, survived. 2. In regard to Norway, the accounts are much less complete and satisfactory. Before the time of Harald Hårfagre, the small chiefs on the west coast seem to have been practically independent. According to the legendary sagas, kingdoms arose from time to time, but for the most part they seem to have been short-lived, and in many districts the local community owed no external obedience. Since it was mainly from the Norwegian coast communities that the colonists of Iceland were drawn, it must be inferred that the organization, both political and religious, of these communities was similar to, and indeed formed a model of, the system which we find in Iceland. It may be assumed, therefore, that each local chief had a temple and a thing place for his dependents, and that he himself discharged priestly duties. As a matter of fact, we find in several cases that the materials used for constructing the new temples in Iceland had been taken from the temples which the same persons had formerly possessed in Norway. Whether the Norwegian patriarchal chiefs usually bore the title Goti is uncertain. Instances, however, occasionally occur. Further inland, a similar system is found, but on a larger scale. Over the district called the Dales, there ruled in St. Olaf's days a hersier named Gudbrandur, who was at it were a king over the district. This man possessed a temple containing a figure of Thor. When St. Olaf came into the Dales to enforce the acceptance of Christianity, Gudbrandur called the men of the district together, and, taking the image out of the temple, they set out to meet the king. The predecessor of this, Gudbrandur, was in alliance with Earl Hakon of Fladlir. They had a temple in common, which contained figures of Thor and of Hakon's patron goddess, Thorgurthur and Urpa. In the saga of King Hakon the Good, Earl Sigurdur of Flatir, Earl Hakon's father, is said to have provided a great sacrificial feast at Flatir, and to have borne the whole expense. In this passage it is stated that it was the duty of the chief who provided the feast to consecrate the air and all the sacrificial meat. The following chapters describe the refusal of the Christian king Hakon take his part in these public feasts, and the dangerous position in which he consequently found himself involved. The Norwegian evidence, therefore, is consistent. From the king or earl down to the village chieftain, priestly duties are everywhere combined with temporal power. We never hear of any person of exclusively priestly character during the whole history of the country. In the case where communities combined for public worship, we find the chiefs undertaking the office of priest in turn. Such was the case with the sacrifices at Mæren in St. Olaf's time. They were held by 12 chiefs in turn. It is to be observed that this was during the reign of a Christian king, and at a time when none of the great heathen chiefs were left in the land. It is quite possible that it was merely the revival of an old custom, which may have been in existence before the rise of the monarchy. 3. For Denmark, our materials on this subject are almost wholly wanting. It would hardly have been necessary to deal with this country had not certain writers brought forward 3 runic inscriptions found in Fien as evidence for the existence of a specifically priestly class. The first inscription is that of Helnes. Hraufr Norgoti erected the stone to the memory of Gothamundr. The second is that of Flimlos. This stone stands in memory of Hraufr, who was Norgoti. These inscriptions evidently refer to the same person and are assigned by Wimmer to the beginning of the 9th century. The third inscription is that of Glavendrup and dates from about 900, according to Wimmer. Regenhilder erected this stone to the memory of Ali Solvagoti, the noble temple priest. The point in dispute is the meaning to be attached to the phrases Noragoti, Sulvagoti. Maurer translates Nori's priest, i.e. a priest in the service of Nori, and takes the latter to be the name of a man. This explanation is, however, unnecessary. Wimmer translates priest of Nurr, a place name of plural form, or possibly the name of the inhabitants of a district. Solva he translates to be the genitive of Solvi, a place name identical with that of Solvi in Norway, or possibly like Nora, a genitive plural denoting the inhabitants of a place. If Wimmer's explanation be adopted, Hrofer and Ali may obviously have been local chieftains, like those on the west coast of Norway. Maurer's hypothesis therefore rests on insecure foundations. Had a priestly class existed, it is curious that we should find no reference to it in Saxo, who frequently refers to laws of the heathen period. 4. There is one distinct reference to the existence of the priestly officials at the Uppsala sanctuary, namely in Adam of Bremen. Assigned to all their gods they have priests to present the sacrifices of the people. But were these officials persons of exclusively priestly character, or were they local chiefs entrusted with the performance of priestly duties, like the Norwegian chieftains at Mæren? In contrast to Norway, the land of small independent communities, Sweden is distinguished from the earliest times by centralization of government. At the beginning of the 11th century, we find the country exclusive of Skåne, divided into 7 provinces, each possessing an assembly and a lagman, lagmater. These lagmen seem at this period to have been men of high position. The succession, at all events in Uppland, was hereditary. Besides the lagmen, there existed in Uppland a council of 12 sages, Spekinger, whose duty it was to advise the king, especially in the administration of justice, and who likewise appeared to have been men of important position. At their head stood, during the reign of Olafur Skutkunger, 3 brothers, Arnviter, Thorviter, and Freviter, the 2 latter being named after the great gods. Similar councils can be shown to have existed in other Scandinavian lands, examples in the Danish settlements in England. Thus Lincoln and Stamford had each a council of 12, who inherited their jurisdiction and bore the title of lawman. Bearing in mind the close connection which everywhere among Teutonic peoples subsists between the law and the priesthood, It seems not unlikely that these consuls are the priests mentioned by Adam. During the reign of the Christian king Olafur, their sacerdotal duties would necessarily have to cease, but they may subsequently have been resumed during the heathen reaction, which was in operation during Adam's time. As regards the number, we may compare the 12 priests who officiated in the sacrifices at Meren. The identification is still more favored by the story of the 12 gods who were appointed by Odin as temple priests, Hofgotar, to keep up the sacrifices and administer justice among men. It has indeed been suggested that the conception of the 12 gods is a purely literary one, and due to classical influence. But the conjecture is needless. A perfectly adequate explanation is provided in the existence of judicial councils of 12, like that at Uppsala. They probably date from very early times, and indeed are not peculiar to the north. Analogies are to be found in England in cases where Danish influence is hardly probable. A more important parallel is supplied by the Frisian saga of the 12 Æsingen, speakers of the law, who could not declare to Karl the Great the nature of Frisian law. Bodies of 12 delegates are found also among the Old Saxons, and in Holstein. But though the priests mentioned by Adam may be identical with the counselors, the position of high priest seems to have belonged properly to the king. In Ynglingatal, the mythical king Alfr is called Vurter Vestals, guardian of the altar. The god Frey, the traditional founder of the ancient royal family, is in Ynglinga's saga distinctly represented as a priest king. Both here and in Saxo, he is said to have instituted the sacrifices at Uppsala. In another passage of Saxo, the origin of the sacrifices is attributed to a king Hadingus, who seems to be identical with Njordr, Frey's father. The sacrifices are, however, said to be offered to Frey. Again, according to Yngling saga, a famine which arose in the days of the legendary king Olafur Tregeligia was attributed by the people to the king's remissness in offering sacrifice. The result was that the king himself was sacrificed. There is evidence even from historical times. In Rimbert's Vita and Skari, the Swedish king seems to perform sacerdotal functions. Together with his nobles, he casts lots before the meeting of the assembly, thus discharging the duty which is assigned by Tacitus to the state priest. Even in the latter part of the 11th century, we find a king, Svein, who was known as Blodsvein, sacrifice Svein. He is said to have obtained the throne on the expulsion of the Christian king Yngvi Stinkelsson by promising to offer sacrifice on behalf of the people. In the north, therefore, priestly duties seem everywhere to be combined with temporal power. The temporal chief is both judge and sacrificial priest. It has been suggested that this absence of a priesthood in the north is a late development, and due to encroachment on the part of the temporal powers. But the evidence points distinctly the other way. In the first place, the gods are represented as priest-kings. The case of the god Frey has already been mentioned. The god Uller seems to bear a similar character. Saxo, after relating the story of Odin's exile, says that the gods elected a certain Urus, not only to the kingdom, but even to the honors of divinity. Immediately afterwards, he speaks of him as a flamen. There seems also to be some reason for believing that Balder was once regarded as a priest-king. Secondly, priesthood and chieftainship have the same emblem, namely the sacred arm ring. In Icelandic temples this was kept, lying upon the altar, but at all public meetings the Goti wore it on his arm, and upon it all oaths were sworn. In Simon's History of the Church of Durham, a northern king, Gutrid, assumes an arm ring as a kind of coronation ceremony. This is to be compared with an incident in the story of the Danish king Hrolfr Kraki, as related in the Prose Edda, namely his attempt to acquire from the Swedish king Adils the ring Svegris, which had belonged to Adil's forefathers. It is to be observed that the gods Ur, Balder, and Frey are represented as possessing sacred arm rings. Moreover, several facts show that northern chiefs bore a more or less sacred character. In the prehistoric age, they were, according to the legends, liable to be sacrificed in times of misfortune. Such was the fate of the Swedish kings Dormaldi and Olafur Tretelgia. They were believed to be responsible for the famines which occurred during their reigns. This can hardly be explained except on the supposition that the king was regarded as the representative of the god. The occurrence of the famine showed that the god was not satisfied with his representative. Again, popular chiefs were sometimes worshipped after death. Such is said to have been the case with the legendary king Olaf Geirstadalfr, and even with a small chief named Grimir, grandfather of one of the settlers of Iceland. Rembertus describes the formal deification of the Swedish king Ericus. Lastly, the dwelling place of northern kings seems, like sanctuaries, to have been regarded as possessing a sacred peace. The term Field of Peace is found applied to the Swedish king's dwelling as early as Beowulf. Section 3. The Northern Priestly System compared with that of the ancient Germans. In the preceding sections, I have endeavored to show, 1. That the priest of the ancient Germans was not a person endowed with the secret knowledge, but a tribal official, and 2. That in the north, priestly duties were always combined with temporal power. It remains for us to inquire which of the two systems is the older. It cannot, of course, be denied that the evidence for the continental system dates from a period long anterior to any record of that which obtained in the north. Yet in the north we can find no trace of any system other than that which existed in historical times, and all the evidence points to its antiquity. But can the continental system be a latter development of one corresponding to that which we see in the north? There are several reasons for at least taking this suggestion into account. The priesthood seems to be an essentially tribal institution. In the private household, and even in the subdivisions of the tribe, priestly duties are, as in the north, performed by the temporal head. This seems to show that the origin of the priesthood is bound up with the tribe as a whole. In spite of the existence of a priesthood, royalty, where it is found, appears to have a sacred character. Among the Burgundians in the 4th century, it was customary to depose the king in time of famine or military disaster. It has been shown above that the Swedes, under similar circumstances, sacrificed their kings. The two customs are clearly of similar origin. Again, that the Merovingian kings were sacred is shown by the fact that, like the gods, they were carried to the assembly in a cart drawn by oxen. During the last century of their existence, they had practically ceased to have any share in the government, and nothing but the sanctity attached to royalty could have preserved the dynasty so long from extinction. The position of the tribal high priest is somewhat analogous to that of the state priests of other European nations. Examples: the Rex Sacrificulus of the Romans, or the Archon Basilius of the Athenians. These latter offices were relics of former monarchy, stripped of all temporal powers. Is not the same explanation possible also here? Can the priesthood of the ancient Germans be due to the former existence of monarchy? In Tacitus's time, most of the tribes with which the Romans came in contact were not monarchical, but this need not always have been the case. A nation may come into existence either through the confederation of smaller communities, as in Iceland, or through their union under one head. That the ancient German tribes arose by the latter is more probable by the fact that many of them occupied territory which had been gained by conquest. For in a state of civilization no further advanced than that of the ancient Germans, offensive warfare can hardly be carried on successfully, except under a permanent head. Again, the genealogies which trace the tribesmen, primarily no doubt the noble families, back to a common ancestor, point to the former existence of monarchy, or at all events of patriarchal government on a large scale. Moreover, it is to be observed that kingly power seems to increase in proportion to the distance we advance from the borders of southern civilization. Of the tribes in the neighborhood of the Roman frontier, only the Hermundari and the Marcomanni are known to have been monarchical, and of these the latter were newcomers. Of the Goths, whose position was far more remote, we are told that they were subject to somewhat more strict kingly government, though not to a degree incompatible with liberty. Among the Swedes, on the other hand, the most remote people of indubitably Teutonic blood, mentioned by Tacitus, the king's power is said to be subject to no reservations. The presence of a priesthood and monarchy side by side in the same state is no insuperable objection to this theory. The case may arise in several ways. The sanctity attached to the king may become so great that he comes to be regarded as too holy to engage in war or to transact worldly business. A viceroy is then appointed, such as we find among the Volga Russians. This viceroyalty may become hereditary and gradually develop into kingship. This is what is actually found among the Franks. The viceroyalty became hereditary among the descendants of Pippin of Leyden, though more than a century elapsed before the Meroving family ceased to reign. In early times, however, it is frequently the case that the monarchy is not coextensive with the tribe. Sometimes we find several kings in the same tribe, a case which often arose through the division of power between brothers. In other cases, the same king rules over several tribes. Such was the case with Arioustus, Marobodus, and other kings with whom the Romans came in contact. This may arise either through conquest or through the attainment of predominant influence in the time of peace. The king of the subject tribe usually disappears sooner or later, but under ordinary conditions, the tribe seems to preserve its corporate existence. Consequently, also its assembly and a tribal priesthood. It may be observed that in the Roman age, the monarchies of the southern and western Germans seem as a rule to have been short-lived. On the whole, therefore, I am much inclined to accept this explanation. It would, of course, be easier to give a definitive answer if we know how the priests were chosen. Jourdain says that, in the case of the Goths, they were drawn from the nobility. But assuming that the same rule held good elsewhere, one would like to know whether the choice was still further limited to the community living in the immediate neighborhood of the tribal sanctuary, for example. There is a certain similarity, as has been shown above, between the position of the priests and that of the lawmen and spekinger of the north. Now among these succession seems in general to be hereditary. The Swedish spekinger, like the ancient kings, appear to have held their position in virtue of their descent from the god Frey. This is shown by a passage of Saxo. Describing the constitution of Ringo's army at the Battle of Bravalla, he proceeds, "The bravest of the Swedes were these: Arwaki, Keklu, Krok Agretist, Guthfast, Gumi from Gislamarkaya. These were the households of the god Frey, and most faithful intermediaries of the deities. Ingi also, and Orli, Olur, and Forki, sons of Elric, embrace Ringo's service. They also trace the origin of their race to the god Frey." Whatever may be the precise meaning of the phrase numinum arbitri, there can, I think, be little doubt that it is the Spekinger, or priest councillors of Uppsala, who are here referred to. May not the priesthood of, for example, the Simnones have originated in a similar manner? Although this tribe formed only an outlying portion of Marobodus' kingdom, they claim to be the oldest and noblest branch of the Suevic race. The chief ground of this claim seems to have lain in the possession of an ancient grove sanctuary, which they believed to be the dwelling place of their god, and the cradle of their race. The presence of embassies from all the kindred tribes at their national festivals testifies to the general acceptance of the claim. I do not see how such assent can have been gained unless the Simnons had once possessed a powerful native dynasty, tracing its descent to the tribal god. Note 1. The tribal tradition. One of the most important elements in the law, which it was the special duty of the priest to preserve, was doubtless the tradition of the tribe's origin. We find references to these traditions even in the Germania. Indeed, from chapter 2, it would seem that the Germans had already become conscious of the unity of their race and been classified the various ancestors in a common genealogy. Such a genealogy necessarily presupposes the existence of many tribal traditions, and consequently also of tribal cults. The question of these tribal cults has hardly received the attention it deserves. I believe that many of the difficulties of Germanic mythology are due to the combination into one system of cults which were once peculiar to different tribes and localities. In the north, the clearest case of a tribal cult is that of Thorgurthr Hulgebruter. In one respect, this cult holds a peculiar position. Thorgurthr is never mentioned as a member of the divine community, either in the mythological poems or in Gylfaginning, nor does she stand in any kind of a relationship to the rest of the gods. Her cults form no part of the Orthodox religion of the North. In Skarpelmar, it is stated that she was the daughter of Hulling, the founder of the Helgoland monarchy. After their deaths, they were both honored with worship. According to Saxo, however, she was the wife of Helgo and daughter of Cuso, king of the Lapps. This seems to be the older version, not only because Saxo gives the myth in some detail, but also because Thorgurthr seems to bear a distinctly Lappish character in her use of the bow and in the practice of magical arts. She seems to have been one of the powers revealed by the Helgolandur Ketil Hengir, who, like other members of his family, did not worship the generally recognized gods. She is also said to have been worshipped by an Icelandic settler named Grimkel, who came from Orkidal, a district to the north of the Trondheim fjord. Beyond this, her cult is only known in connection with the celebrated Earl Hakon of Hrettir, who ruled Norway from 975 to 995. She and her sister Ulpa seem to have been the chief, if not the only, objects of his worship. He raised several costly temples to her honor, and is even reported, on what appears to be a fairly good authority, to have sacrificed his son to her in the battle with the Hjomsvikingar. Yet, in spite of Hakon's great position, and the fact that he was the last important champion of heathenism in Norway, her cult seems to have met with no general acceptance. She appears indeed to have been regarded rather as a troll than a goddess. How then is Hakon's worship to be explained? The reason is that he traces descent from the ancient kings of Helgoland. When his ancestors migrated to the south, they must have brought their family cult with them. The persistent nature of family worship is shown by the fact that we find the family settled in the neighborhood of the Trondheim fjord, at least a century before Hakon acquired the government of Norway. There is reason for believing that the cult of Frey is another and more important example of the same class. Frey was one of the great gods of the north, and his cult deserves close attention. It has been generally assumed by modern mythologists that he was a god of the sky or sun. But for this theory there is no ground beyond an isolated passage in the Gylfaginning. The mythological poems throw little light on his character and need not be discussed here. But the allusions to his cult, which are fairly frequent in historical and quasi-historical works, will, I think, when carefully considered, place beyond doubt that it was originally of a local or tribal character. According to Adam of Bremen, the temple at Uppsala contained 3 figures, representing the gods Thor, Odin, and Friggo, respectively. Of Friggo, by which he certainly means Frey, he says that he was regarded as the dispenser of peace and pleasure to mortals, that his representation was phallic, and that he was invoked especially at marriages. Elsewhere, Frey is represented as the giver of fertility in general. In Sweden, his image was carried round the country, apparently in autumn, in a cart drawn by oxen, and accompanied by a young woman who attended to his sanctuary, and was regarded as his god's wife. His cult was known also in Norway, especially in Inner Trondheim, and from Norway was carried to Iceland, where it seems to have been connected especially with the harvest festival. Freyr, Njordr, and Thor were the 3 names invoked at the opening of the Icelandic assembly, and in the oath which was taken in courts of justice, which seems to show that they were regarded as the chief gods of the land. The Yngling Saga gives the following account of Frey. Njordr and his son Frey did not originally belong to the Aesir, Odin's tribe, but to a tribe named Vanir. They were given to the Aesir as hostages. Odin made them temple priests, and after his death, Njordr and subsequently Frey succeeded him in the monarchy. They continued to receive the tribute which had first been paid to Odin, and their reigns were blessed with prosperity and peace. Frey fixed his capital at Uppsala and built a great temple there. When he died, his death was concealed, and his body carried secretly into a great hell. The tribute money was still taken and poured into the hell. After 3 years, the Swedes became aware that he was dead, but since prosperity and peace still continued, they believed that such would be the case as long as Frey was in Sweden. Therefore, they would not burn him in accordance with Odin's ordinances, but they called him the God of the world, and sacrificed to him for peace and prosperity ever afterwards. The saga then goes on to describe the reigns of his son and grandson and subsequent descendants, the Yngling kings of Sweden. According to this story, Frey is obviously the tribal god of the Uppland Swedes and the ancestor of the Yngling family. We have seen, however, that he has also worshipped in Norway, yet the cult may have been brought here from Sweden. When King Olaf Tryggvason was Christianizing the district of Inner Trondheim, he seized the figure of Frey out of its temple and brought it to the assembly. He is represented in the saga as haranguing the assembly in order to convince them that the figure was not divine. Frey, he said, was a king who formerly lived in Sweden. He was so popular that on his death it was resolved that some men should be shut up alive with him in his howl. No one, however, was willing to undergo this fate. They therefore made 2 wooden men and put them in the howe with Frey, under the supposition that these would give him pleasure. After a long lapse of time, robbers broke into the howe and took out the wooden figures. They were then overcome with fear and fled. The Swedes kept one of the figures and sent the other to Trondheim. Both were called Frey and worshipped. This story seems to show that the cult of Frey was believed to have been imported into Norway from Sweden. There is no evidence that Frey was ever worshipped in Denmark. He is mentioned, however, by Saxo 5 times. 2 of these passages, referring to him as the ancestor of Swedish heroes at Bravalla, have already been quoted. The other passages are, which states that Hedingus, having killed an unknown sea monster, offered a sacrifice to Frey in order to propitiate the deities. He ordained this sacrifice to be a permanent institution, recurring regularly as the years rolled by. It is called Freyblod by the Swedes. Again, Frey, the satrap of the gods, took up his abode near Uppsala and instituted a new method of sacrifice to the gods by offering human victims. Lastly, Starkatharus says 7 years in Sweden with the sons of Frey until the proceedings at Uppsala, at the time of the sacrifices, drive him away in disgust. This seems to have been during the days of the Yngling dynasty. In every passage, therefore, Saxo seems to regard Frey as an essentially Swedish god. Fröblod is probably the name of the great Uppsala festival. All accounts then point to Sweden, and especially Uppsala, as the home of the cult. The story of the Howe burial and the belief that the preservation of Frey's body would entail a continuance of the blessings which have been enjoyed during his lifetime is an illustration of the common northern belief that the spirits of the dead continued their existence in the family Howe and were able to confer blessings upon their surviving kinsfolk and descendants. We may compare the burial of Halfdan the Black, father of Harold Harfagri. On the account of his popularity, the 4 regions of his kingdom disputed for the possession of his body. The dispute was settled by the cutting of the body up into 4 pieces, each of which was howlaid in a different region. The cult of Frey, though by far the most important of these ancestral cults, does not by any means stand alone. There can be little doubt that Skjoldr must once have occupied among the Danes a position somewhat similar to that of Frey among the Swedes. In extant documents, he is not often referred to as a god, but the importance of his cult may be estimated by the long continuance of the name Skurdungar as a designation for the Danes. I suspect also that the origin of the Balder myths is to be found in a tribal cult, though it is difficult to fix its locality. At any rate, the existence of 2 independent traditions, the one favorable, the other hostile to Balder, seems best to be explained on this hypothesis. It is not unlikely that the cults of Urur and Heimdall has similar origin. Cults of the same kind were known also on the continent. In the old Saxon renunciation formula, the convert is called upon to renounce Thune, Wodan, and Saxnat. The last name is identical with the name Saxnat, which stands at the head of the royal genealogy of Essex. We can scarcely go wrong in referring this personage as a tribal god of the Saxons. Most of the other English royal houses traced their descent through Woden to a certain Geat, of whom Acer says that he was worshipped long ago by the pagans as a god. He seems to be the same individual who is represented as robbed of all sleep by his passionate love. Heligoland was dedicated to a god, Fosit. This name is never met with elsewhere, and seems likely that his cult was purely local. Tacitus says that the Germans classified their race in 3 great divisions: Iguanos, Herminones, and Istaunes, according to their descents from the 3 sons of Manus. Seems likely, therefore, that worship was once paid to these brothers. Perhaps the cult of Ermin may be traced. When the elder Drusus was on his expedition to the Elbe in BC 9, he heard that there were pillars of Hercules in existence, but was prevented from obtaining more precise information by the difficulty of crossing the sea. From Tacitus's accounts, it would seem that these pillars were rumored to be in the direction of Holstein. Now this was in the 2nd century, the country occupied by the Saxons. In the time of Karl the Great, that is to say, some centuries after the westward migration of the Saxons, the chief object of their worship was a lofty wooden pillar in the neighborhood of Eresberg. This pillar, which was called Ilmensel, was destroyed by Karl in the year 772. Is it not likely that the Saxons practiced a similar cult in their earlier home, and that this was the source of the story mentioned by Tacitus? This view is especially favored by a passage of Widukind. After describing a legendary victory of the Saxons, he proceeds: "In the morning they planted their eagle at the eastern gate, and piling up an altar of victory, they paid appropriate reverence to the objects of their worship, according to the superstition of their fathers, representing by name Mars, by the likeness of pillars of Hercules, by position the sun, who is called Apollo by the Greeks. By Mars he means Ermin, as is shown by the next sentence. Hence the view of those who hold that the Saxons are descended from the Greeks has a certain amount of probability, for Mars is called Hermin or Hermes in Greek. In spite of the confusion of native and Greco-Roman mythology, this passage shows that the Irminsul was connected with the cult of a deity or hero named Irmin, and renders it probable that this was the god whom the Romans called Hercules. The cult of Hercules was known also to the Cherusci, another tribe of the Irmines, though there is no evidence that the cult here took the same form. Probably the cult of Irmin was known to all the Irminos, but its association with the sacred pillar may have been peculiar to the Saxons. In the same way, it seems to me not unlikely that the cult of Frey was originally only a local form of a far more widely spread religion. It has often been remarked that Frey bears a strong resemblance to Froti, the mythical peace king of the Danes. Again, the cult has features in common with that of Nerthus, attributed by Tacitus to certain tribes on the southwest shores of the Baltic. The word Nerthus is identical with Njordr, the name of Frey's father, while Frey itself seems to be an abbreviation for Ingi Frey or Ingunar Frey, which recall the Inguenus of the Roman age. It seems likely, therefore, that a similar cult was once common to all the maritime tribes. Note 2. Priestesses and Prophetesses in the north. In Icelandic historical works, the word gytja occasionally occurs. It seems to be applied to women who belong to the magisterial families. In Kristni, we hear of a certain Friðgerðr, who is represented as offering sacrifice, and who is called gytja, in a verse immediately following. Her husband was absent when the sacrifice was offered, but whether she was acting as his representative or not is not stated. In Vatnfirðinga, mention is made of a woman called Steinvor, who possessed a public temple and claimed the temple dues from merchants. When these were withheld by a Christian merchant, she applied to her relative, Brodhelgi, for assistance. The case is not altogether clear. It seems probable, however, that Steinvor had inherited the temple, but that the magisterial rights pertaining thereto, which could not be held by a woman, had passed to Brodhelgi, perhaps as the nearest male relative. A Þurithr Hofgytja is mentioned, and a Þorlágytja, but in these cases the reason for the title is not stated. There is no ground for supposing that the Gytju laid claim to prophetic powers, any more than the Gotar. Outside Iceland there is no historical evidence for the name, though there is no reason why such persons should not have existed, at least in Norway. The Volva, or wise woman, is a being of an entirely different class. The Icelandic Volir were women who wandered from place to place, foretelling the future and practicing seder, magic. There were no recognized position in the state, but Volir, who had acquired a reputation, were often received with great honor and accompanied by a considerable number of attendants. Their character seems to have been much the same in Norway and other northern lands. Their powers were not doubted, and in the mythological poems Voluspa and Vegtamskvitha, we find them consulted even by the gods. Yet they appear to be more or less in opposition to the Orthodox religion of the North. The mythological poems represent them as hostile to the gods, and the latter disguise themselves when they consult them. It seems probable that the Volur are survivals of a more primitive form of religion. They are to be compared with the Haliarunos, or sorceresses, who, according to the legend related by Jordanes, were expelled by the Gothic king Filmer from his territories. They seem to have been largely of Lappish or Finnish nationality. In Vatnsdæla, and we find mention of a Lappish vulva named Hether. This seems to be a generic name. It is applied also to a mythical vulva in Voluspa. In Hinluliot, Hether and Hrosthjofr are said to be a sister and brother. The latter is the Rostiophus Finicus, who, according to Saxo, was consulted by Odin after Baldur's death. In Yngling Saga, the mythical Volva Hurdur is represented as practicing Seter on behalf of the Finnish queen Drifa. The Volur seem to be related in some way to the Nornir. The latter are not, it is true, mentioned in any document that can claim to be historical, but it seems no unlikely that some primitive custom may be traced in the legends, which relate how Norns came to a house to shape the destiny of a newly born child. It is probable that in early times, but little distinction was drawn between the shaping and the foretelling of destiny. The term Githur is never applied to the Volur, and there is no evidence that they were regarded as priestesses. They have no part in the three distinctive duties of the Germanic priesthood, namely the offering of public sacrifices, the preservation of the law, and the guardianship of the sanctuary. On the other hand, it is possible that there may have been at certain sanctuaries a class of priestesses distinct from the Icelandic Githur, and showing a certain resemblance to the Volur. According to Ynglinga Saga, the goddess Freyja was a Blotgithja, sacrificial priestess, and first taught Seter to the Aesir. After Frey's death, she kept up the temple and the sacrifices at Uppsala, all the other gods being now dead. But it is doubtful if this story is founded on old tradition, for there is no evidence that Freyja was known in Sweden. She was the favorite goddess of Icelandic mythology, and the author may have contrived to bring her into the story by introducing a feature from the political organization of his own country. It is possible, however, that there were women somewhat resembling Volur at the Uppsala sanctuary. In the portraiture of the mythological sanctuary Asgardr, 3 maidens or Norns are represented as living beneath Yggdrasil's ash. Their duties were to water the tree from the sacred spring and to shape the destiny of man. Now it can hardly be doubted that the picture of Asgardr is in great measure drawn from some northern sanctuary, and in all probability this was Uppsala. It is not indeed stated that there were Norns beneath the evergreen, or in the neighborhood of the sacred spring at Uppsala, but it was apparently a northern custom to deliver prophetic utterances beside sacred springs. We know also that Uppsala possessed an oracle so famous that it was consulted even by foreign princes. Again, in the story of Gunnar Helmingur, whatever may be its foundation in fact, we find mention of a young woman who attended to Frey's sanctuary and consulted his will. The hypothesis, therefore, has a certain amount of probability. But it is to be observed that the word Gitja is not used in the story of Gunnar Helmingur. And if the sanctuary prophetesses at Uppsala form the model of the mythical Norns, it is hardly likely that they can have been regarded as priestesses in the northern sense. They are rather to be compared with the Greek prophetesses at the shrine of Delphi, while the Gotar or Spekingar may have corresponded in some degree to the fancy Greek word.